The Jinho dismantled his entire security and domestic detail in under 12 minutes. It wasn't the armed guards who had allowed an unauthorized vehicle to idle near the compound gates. It wasn't the chef who had prepared salmon instead of mackerel. It was the photograph. He had returned to his Gangnam fortress after 16 hours of orchestrating a weapons deal that would reshape the Seoul underworld's power structure. And the first thing that stopped him cold was the sight. The frame. A single silver-framed photograph on his obsidian desk had been moved exactly 2 inches to the left. The head of security, a man named Director Beek who had served 3 presidents and 2 chaebols before entering Jinho's service, stepped forward with military precision. "Sir, the cleaning staff may have bumped it during dusting. I assure you it won't." "Who gave them permission to touch my desk?" Director Beek's posture stiffened. "Sir, I don't understand." "The photograph." Jinho's voice was ice. He never raised his voice. The most dangerous men never do. "Where were your eyes when someone violated the one rule that keeps them breathing?" "We thought routine maintenance." "There's that word." He set his leather portfolio down on the marble surface, not looking away from Beek. "Thought, initiative, consideration." He looked at the man directly for the first time. "Unsolicited thinking is a form of chaos, Director Beek, and I have built an empire by eliminating chaos." "Mr. Duh, I was only ensuring." "You're terminated, all of you." 12 people, 12 careers, 12 families' livelihoods erased in the time it took to move a photograph 2 inches. The story rippled through Seoul's shadow elite by dawn. "A photograph," whispered Madame Hong at her exclusive tea salon in Cheongdam-dong, her jade cup frozen halfway to her lips. "He executed an entire staff over a photograph being moved 2 inches. "I heard it was because someone looked him in the eye," said Chairwoman Seo, who made it her business to trade in everyone else's secrets and scandals. "No, it was definitely the photograph," insisted Heiress Yoon. "My sister's business partner's associate runs the premium staffing agency. Apparently the man is untouchable, absolutely untouchable. Powerful, devastatingly handsome, and completely inhuman." "He's not inhuman," said Lady Nam, the only woman at the table who had been in Da Jinho's presence. She was the wife of a telecommunications magnate and had once sat across from him during a charity auction. "He's hollow. You can see it when you meet his eyes, like staring into a vault where someone locked away everything human and threw away the combination." The other women fell silent, disturbed by the observation's accuracy. The staffing agency director understood the assignment immediately. "You need a ghost," she said into the phone, her tone professional despite the 3 a.m. call. "Someone who exists in service but never in presence. I have exactly one candidate who fits that profile." Courtney Tolliver arrived at the compound 3 days later. She didn't knock. She didn't announce herself. She simply appeared in the service entrance at precisely 6:47 a.m., dressed in black from collar to hem, her hair pulled back so severely it might have been painted on. She carried no purse, no phone, no personal effects that might suggest she had a life beyond these walls. The interim security chief, a nervous man named Officer Shin who was desperately trying not to become the next casualty, reviewed her credentials with shaking hands. "You understand, Mr. Does. Requirements." "I don't speak unless spoken to. I don't adjust anything without explicit instruction. I don't exist in his sightline unless summoned." Courtney's voice was measured, professional, empty of personality. "I've worked for 3 foreign diplomats, 2 tech CEOs, and 1 man whose name I signed an NDA never to mention. I specialize in erasure." Officer Shin looked relieved and terrified in equal measure. "He's not like other employers." "They never are," Courtney replied, and something in her tone suggested she had seen far worse than a man who demanded silence. What Officer Shin didn't know, what the agency didn't know, what Da Jinho himself didn't know, was that Courtney Tolliver hadn't applied for this position. She had been searching for it. For 20 years, she had been searching for the boy with the scarred hands who had promised her, in broken Korean learned from harbor workers, that he would survive, that he would become powerful, that he would come back for her. She had just never imagined he would become this. Da Jinho watched the hallway camera for 17 minutes before he accepted that she was real. The woman moved through his fortress like water finding cracks in stone, silent, inevitable, leaving no trace except the subtle perfection she left behind. She had been in his employ for exactly 9 hours, and already the house felt different, not warmer. Jinho didn't deal in warmth, but organized in a way that suggested someone had finally understood the architecture of his isolation. He sat in his third-floor office, the one room in the compound without windows, surrounded by monitors that showed every angle of his domain. 23 screens displayed 23 different perspectives of a world he controlled absolutely. And on screen 7, Courtney Tolliver moved through the second-floor hallway with movements so economical they bordered on ceremonial. She carried no cleaning cart, no basket of supplies, just a small black bag that she set down every 3 meters, extracting exactly what she needed before moving to the next station. A cloth, a bottle, a different cloth, another solution. Each tool returned to the bag before she touched the next surface, as if cross-contamination between tasks would violate some sacred code. Jinho leaned forward, studying her profile. She was perhaps 30 years old, though her face held the kind of careful neutrality that made age irrelevant. Dark skin that caught the recessed lighting in a way that reminded him of polished wood. Hair pulled back so tightly it must have hurt, not a single strand daring to escape. She wore the standard black uniform the agency had provided, but on her it looked less like workwear and more like camouflage. She stopped in front of the console table, the one where he left his keys, his watch, the small items he emptied from his pockets when he returned from business that often left blood on his cuffs. The surface was clean. He had inspected it himself that morning, but she tilted her head slightly, as if listening to something the furniture was trying to tell her, and then she was wiping it down with a solution that smelled of nothing at all. No vanilla, no cedarwood, no competing scent that would announce her presence or suggest she had opinions about what his fortress should smell like. She understood the first rule. This house belongs to silence. Jinho switched to camera 12, which showed the master bedroom from the eastern corner. She had been in there an hour ago. He rewound the footage, watching her enter the space with visible hesitation, not fear exactly, but the wariness of someone entering a predator's den. She had stood in the doorway for a full minute before crossing the threshold, and when she did, her eyes had swept the room not as a maid evaluating surfaces to clean, but as someone reading a crime scene. The bed, made with military precision but untouched for 3 days. The desk by the window, covered in documents he hadn't filed because filing them would mean acknowledging they existed. The chair in the corner, the expensive ergonomic thing an interior designer had insisted he needed, still wrapped in its original plastic because Jinho didn't sit in chairs when he was alone. He paced, or he stood. Or he lay in bed fully dressed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for dawn so he could return to the office where the noise of business drowned out the noise in his head. Courtney had seen all of it, and instead of cleaning in sequence, the way a normal maid would, she had started with the desk. Not the surface, she hadn't touched the papers, but the area around it, the floor where he paced, the window he never opened, the radiator beneath it that probably hadn't worked in years because he kept the temperature at a constant 18 degrees Celsius regardless of season. She moved like she was erasing evidence of his humanity. No, that wasn't quite right. She moved like she was protecting evidence of his humanity, covering the tracks of his vulnerability so no one else would see them. Jinho's jaw tightened. He switched cameras again, finding her in the library, a room he visited perhaps twice a year, always at night, always when insomnia made him feel like his skull was cracking open. The books were organized by height and color, a designer's aesthetic that prioritized appearance over content. He hated it. Hated walking into a room that looked like a photograph instead of a place where someone might actually read. Courtney stood in front of the shelves, her head tilted in that particular way again. Then she reached up and pulled out a book from the third shelf, a Korean translation of Crime and Punishment that Jinho had read when he was 19, and trying to understand if what he was becoming had a name in literature. She opened it, saw the dog-eared pages and the marginalia in his teenage handwriting, and closed it carefully. Then she moved it to eye level, spine out, in a place where he would see it immediately upon entering. She did this 4 more times. Each book she relocated was one he had actually read, actually marked, actually bled his younger self into. She was reorganizing his library not by color or size, but by violence, by meaning, By the books that had mattered to the boy who no longer existed. How did she know? Jinho's fingers hovered over the intercom button. He could ask her. He could demand an explanation for why she was rearranging his books, for why she seemed to understand the topology of his loneliness better than he did. But asking would break the spell of her invisibility, and something told him that breaking that spell would mean losing her entirely. So he watched. She moved to the kitchen next, his kitchen, the one he paid a chef to stock but never to enter. The refrigerator contained ingredients organized with pharmaceutical precision, proteins on the second shelf, vegetables in the crisper, condiments in the door. Everything dated, everything rotated, everything untouched except for the single shelf on the bottom where Jinho kept the things he actually ate when no one was watching. Cup noodles, cheap ones, the kind sold in convenience stores for a few $100. White rice in plastic containers that he microwaved and ate standing over the sink. Kimchi that came prepackaged because he had never learned to make it himself, had never had someone to teach him. Courtney opened the refrigerator and stared at that bottom shelf for a long time. Long enough that Jinho's pulse quickened, though he couldn't say why. Then she closed it without touching anything, without rearranging or judging or replacing his poverty food with something more appropriate for a man who could buy a restaurant on a whim. She had seen who he really was, and she had left it alone. Jinho exhaled slowly, unaware he had been holding his breath. She moved through the kitchen with systematic efficiency after that, cleaning surfaces that were already clean, organizing spaces that were already organized. But there was something almost ritualistic about it, as if she was establishing territory, claiming the space not for herself, but for the potential of what it could be. She opened cabinets and closed them, tested the water pressure at the sink. Checked the alignment of the dish towels on the rack, 3 of them, white, untouched, purchased by an assistant who assumed Jinho might someday have guests. When she finished, she stood in the center of the kitchen for exactly 30 seconds, hands folded at her waist, eyes closed. If Jinho didn't know better, he would have thought she was praying. But people like her didn't pray. People who knew how to make themselves invisible had long ago stopped believing anyone was listening. The rest of the day passed in similar fashion. She moved through the fortress with the determination of someone conducting a survey, mapping the territory of his isolation room by room. The gym he never used. The media room with the projector still in its box. The guest bedrooms that had never hosted guests because Jinho didn't have friends, only associates, and associates didn't sleep under his roof. But it was the small room on the 4th floor that made Jinho's blood run cold. He had forgotten about that room. Or rather, he had trained himself not to remember it. It was supposed to be a storage space, according to the architectural plans. But when Jinho had moved into the fortress 6 years ago, he had put exactly one thing in that room. A cardboard box containing the only possessions he had kept from his life before power, before money, before he became the kind of man other men feared. The door was locked. He had the only key, kept it on a chain he never wore, buried in a drawer he never opened. But on camera 19, he watched Courtney stop in front of that door. She didn't try the handle, didn't test whether it was locked. She simply stood there, palm flat against the wood, as if she could feel the weight of what was stored behind it. Then she did something that made Jinho's throat tighten. She leaned forward and pressed her forehead against the door. It lasted less than 5 seconds. Then she straightened, smoothed her uniform, and continued down the hallway as if nothing had happened. But Jinho had seen it. That moment of breaking, of allowing herself one gesture of recognition toward the pain she sensed living in this house. Who was she? Not just who was she now, this professional ghost who seemed to understand the architecture of trauma like a native language. But who had she been before? What had happened to her that taught her to read loneliness like Braille, to navigate suffering like it was a map she had memorized? Jinho pulled up her employment file on his computer. Courtney Tolliver, 32 years old, American citizen with permanent residency in South Korea. References from 3 diplomatic households and 2 corporate executives, each one describing her as exceptionally professional. Invisible, perfect for high-security environments. No emergency contacts listed. No family mentioned. No personal history, beyond a decade of moving through other people's houses like a ghost, leaving no trace except their gratitude that someone finally understood what they needed was silence. The file told him nothing real, nothing true. He switched back to the live feed. She was in the main foyer now, standing in front of the only photograph he displayed in the public areas of his house. It was a piece of art, technically, a black and white image of the Incheon harbor at dawn, taken by some acclaimed photographer whose name Jinho couldn't remember. He had bought it because looking at it hurt, and he had long ago learned that controlled pain was better than numbness. Courtney stared at the photograph for 2 full minutes. Then she reached up, not to touch it, not to move it, but to adjust the lighting above it, tilting the track light 1/2 degree so the glare didn't wash out the dock workers visible in the background. Jinho's hands curled into fists on his desk. She knew, somehow, impossibly, she knew that those background figures were what mattered. That he hadn't bought this photograph for the composition or the artistic merit. He had bought it because if he squinted at those blurred shapes in the distance, he could almost pretend one of them was the girl who had saved his life by sharing a handful of rice she had probably stolen herself. The girl whose name he had never learned because she had refused to tell him, had said names were dangerous in a place where people disappeared. "Just remember my face," she had said. "When you're rich and powerful and safe, remember the girl who believed you'd survive." Jinho switched off the monitors one by one until only screen 7 remained, showing Courtney as she climbed the stairs to begin cleaning the 3rd floor. She would find him eventually. He worked from this office, slept in this office more often than his bedroom, existed in this office like a ghost, haunting the command center of his own empire. But for now, he let her move through his house, reading the map of his damage, seeing all the ways he had tried to build a fortress big enough to contain the boy he used to be. And as he watched her disappear around the corner, heading toward the eastern wing where his childhood box sat locked behind a door she would never open, Jinho realized something that terrified him more than any rival's gun or betrayal. She wasn't here to clean his house. She was here to save him. Again. The obsession began on the 3rd day, though Jinho would never have called it that. Obsession implied loss of control, and Jinho had built his empire on the foundation of absolute control. What he was doing was tactical surveillance, risk assessment, due diligence on an employee who had access to every room in his fortress, who moved through his private spaces with the kind of familiarity that should have taken months to develop. That's what he told himself at 3:47 a.m. when he realized he had been watching the same loop of footage for 40 minutes. The clip showed Courtney in his office, his actual office, not the public-facing one on the 2nd floor where he met with lawyers and accountants. She had entered at 11:23 p.m. the previous night. Nearly 3 hours after he had left for a meeting in Itaewon that involved negotiations best conducted in basements where soundproofing mattered. He had reviewed this footage 12 times now, searching for the moment when she would slip, when the professional mask would crack and reveal whatever game she was playing. Because everyone was playing a game. Jinho had learned that truth before he learned to read. But Courtney never slipped. She moved through his office like she was defusing a bomb, every gesture calibrated to minimize impact. She didn't sit in his chair, didn't even look at it. She cleaned around his desk in careful arcs, never disturbing the specific chaos of his paperwork. 3 staplers sat on the left corner because he could never find one when he needed it, so he kept buying more. She straightened them into a row, aligned by size, then paused and returned them to their original scattered positions. She had recognized his chaos as intentional. Jinho rewound the footage again, watching her hands. She wore thin black gloves that made her fingers look longer, more elegant than they probably were. No jewelry except... He froze the frame. There, on her left hand, 4th finger, the edge of something metallic visible beneath the glove's cuff. Jinho enhanced the image, zooming until the pixels started to fragment. The metal was dull, unpolished. Copper, possibly, or brass. Definitely not silver or gold, nothing that suggested wealth or status. It looked handmade, the kind of thing someone might twist together from salvaged materials when they couldn't afford the real thing. The kind of thing an orphan might make. Jinho's pulse quickened. He switched to a different angle, camera 14, which showed Courtney from the side as she cleaned the window behind his desk. The morning light was stronger here, and when she reached up to wipe the glass, the glove pulled back slightly. There, the ring, Crude wire wrapped around her finger, something small and translucent caught in the coils. Sea glass, maybe, or plastic. The image quality wasn't good enough to tell. Why would a professional maid wear a ring like that? The agencies train their people to remove all jewelry, to present themselves as blank slates without personal history or preference. Courtney had followed every other protocol perfectly. Her nails were trimmed short, unpainted. No earrings, no necklace, no watch. Nothing except this one piece of trash jewelry she refused to remove. Jinho pulled up the employment contract the agency had sent over. Standard terms, standard clauses, standard prohibitions against personal effects that might interfere with duties or suggest unprofessional conduct. Jewelry was explicitly mentioned. Staff members shall refrain from wearing ornamental items that may cause damage to client property or present a distraction. She was violating her contract, which meant the ring mattered more than her job. He should fire her. That's what the old Jinho would have done, the one who had fired 12 people over a moved photograph. But the old Jinho hadn't spent 3 days watching someone move through his house like she was reading his autobiography written in furniture and dust patterns. Instead, he opened a new search window and pulled up every piece of footage from the past 72 hours. Then he did what he had trained himself never to do. He looked for himself in someone else's behavior. The compilation took him 6 hours to assemble. By the time he finished, the sun was rising over Gangnam, painting his monitor wall in shades of gold that felt accusatory. Jinho hadn't slept, hadn't eaten, hadn't done anything except watch Courtney Tolliver piece together the puzzle of his broken life with nothing but observation and what appeared to be intuition bordering on supernatural. Exhibit 1, the kitchen, day 2, 6:15 a.m. Courtney opened the refrigerator and stared at his bottom shelf, the one with the convenience store food he ate when the weight of pretending to be civilized became too heavy. She didn't reorganize it, didn't throw it away, but she did add something, a single bowl of homemade kimchi in a glass container, tucked in the back where he might not notice it immediately. No note, no explanation. Just food that tasted like someone gave a damn whether he ate real meals. Jinho had found it that evening and stood in front of the open refrigerator for 10 minutes, trying to remember the last time someone had fed him without being paid to do it. Exhibit 2, the gym, day 2, 2:34 p.m. Courtney spent 40 minutes in the exercise room he never used, but she didn't clean the equipment. Instead, she lowered the bench press bar to a height that would suit someone 5'9", Jinho's exact height. She set the treadmill to a walking speed and queued up a playlist on the connected tablet. Old Korean hip-hop from the early 2000s, the kind that had played from stolen radios in the Incheon Harbor warehouses, where Jinho had learned that survival meant being faster and meaner than everyone else. How did she know what music he had listened to as a teenager? The playlist wasn't saved anywhere in his house. He didn't stream music, didn't keep digital records of his preferences. The only way she could know was if. Jinho stopped that thought before it could finish forming. Coincidence. It had to be coincidence. Exhibit 3, the library, day 3, 11:47 p.m. This was the footage that had started his spiral into whatever this was. Courtney had returned to the library, this time carrying a small stepladder. She climbed up to the top shelf, the one where Jinho kept books he had stolen over the years, first editions and rare prints he had taken from the homes of rivals he had destroyed. Trophies, essentially. Evidence of his evolution from powerless to untouchable. She pulled down every single one. 32 books, carried to the kitchen in careful stacks. Then she spent the next hour doing something that made Jinho's chest tighten until he could barely breathe. She was removing the bookplates. The elegant stickers that announced these volumes had belonged to CEOs and politicians and crime bosses who no longer existed. She was erasing their previous ownership, making them his. When she finished, she returned the books to the shelf, but in a different order. Chronological. Organized by the dates Jinho had acquired them, creating a timeline of his ascension written in stolen literature. She had turned his trophies into a memoir. Jinho pushed back from his desk, packing the office with the kind of restless energy that usually preceded violence. But there was no one to hurt here, no threat to neutralize. Just a maid who seemed determined to excavate the humanity he had buried under layers of calculated cruelty. He pulled up the agency file again, this time looking for something he had missed. The director who had placed Courtney was a woman named Madame Choi, a former corporate executive who had built her staffing empire by treating domestic workers like interchangeable machines. Jinho had worked with her before. She was efficient, discreet, and utterly devoid of empathy. He dialed her number. She answered on the second ring, her voice crisp despite the early hour. "Mr. Duh, I trust the placement is satisfactory. Tell me about Courtney Tolliver." A pause. "Is there a problem with her performance?" "I asked you to tell me about her." Another pause, this one longer. "She's one of my most reliable contractors. Excellent references, no complaints from previous employers. She specializes in high-security placements where discretion is paramount." "That's not what I asked." "Mr. Duh, I'm not sure what you're looking for. Where did she come from? Before the diplomatic work, before the corporate placements. Where was she?" "I don't keep those kinds of records. My clients pay for competence, not biography." Jinho's voice dropped to the register he used when he was done asking politely. "I'm not your client right now, Madame Choi. I'm the man who knows about the side business you run placing domestic workers in homes where they report back on their employer's activities. I'm the man who has chosen not to destroy you for that betrayal of client trust. So when I ask you a question, you answer it completely, or we revisit our understanding of professional courtesy." Silence. Then, "She came from the refugee community. Nigerian family, immigrated when she was 8 or 9. The mother died young, cancer. The father worked 3 jobs and still couldn't keep them off the streets. Courtney aged out of the foster system and started cleaning houses because it paid cash and didn't ask questions. She's been invisible her whole life, Mr. Duh. That's why she's so good at it." Jinho's hand tightened on the phone. "The ring she wears, do you know anything about it?" "I told her to remove it. She refused. Said it was the only thing she owned that mattered. That she'd rather lose the placement than take it off. I made an exception because..." Madame Choi's voice took on a bitter edge. "Because she's too good at making rich men comfortable in their fortresses. And rich men don't care what jewelry their maids wear as long as the work gets done." "You talk about her like she's a tool." "She is a tool, Mr. Duh. That's what all of them are. That's what they understand themselves to be. The sooner they accept it, the better they survive in homes like yours." Jinho hung up without responding. He sat in the dark of his office, listening to the fortress breathe around him, and felt something crack open in his chest that he had spent 20 years trying to seal shut. Courtney Tolliver wasn't just good at invisibility because she had been trained. She was good at it because the world had taught her that being visible meant being hurt, that taking up space was dangerous, that the only value she possessed was her ability to serve without existing. The exact same lesson Jinho had learned in the harbor orphanage, only he had responded by becoming the most visible man in Seoul. By building an empire so vast that no one could ignore him, so terrifying that no one would dare try to erase him again. But Courtney had gone the other direction. She had made herself small, quiet, unnoticeable, a ghost haunting other people's lives. And now she was haunting his. Jinho pulled up the live feed, searching for her current location. He found her in the 3rd-floor hallway, dusting picture frames that held photographs he had never bothered to look at, generic art the interior designer had installed to make the walls less empty. She moved from frame to frame with methodical precision, and for a moment Jinho thought this was just routine maintenance. Then he saw her pause in front of the last frame, saw her lean closer, studying the image with an intensity that didn't match the task. It was a photograph of a harbor, some artistic shot of industrial docks at sunset, not the ancient image from downstairs. This was different, grittier, the kind of photograph that was supposed to represent urban authenticity or some other design magazine concept. Courtney reached up and touched the glass, her gloved finger tracing something in the background. Jinho zoomed the camera in, following her gesture. There, in the far corner of the image, barely visible through the grain and shadows, 2 figures. Children, maybe, sitting on a piling, sharing something between them. Courtney's hand dropped to her side. Her shoulders rose and fell with a breath that looked like it hurt. Then she straightened her spine, adjusted her gloves, and continued down the hallway as if nothing had happened. But Jinho had seen it. That moment when the invisible woman allowed herself to be visible, if only to a photograph that held a memory she shouldn't have had access to. He switched to thermal imaging, an upgrade he had installed because paranoia was cheaper than vulnerability. The heat signature showed Courtney's body temperature had spiked in the last 30 seconds, her pulse visibly elevated even through the camera's digital translation. She was feeling something, and she was working very hard to hide it. Jinho made a decision that would either confirm his growing suspicion or prove he had finally lost his grip on reality. He picked up his phone and composed a text message to his head of security. Pull all archived surveillance from the Incheon Harbor District, 2004-2006. Focus on the orphanage near Dock 7. I need facial recognition run on every child in every frame. Priority assignment. He sent the message, then returned to watching Courtney move through his house. This woman who cleaned like she was performing surgery, who understood his pain like she had lived it, who wore a piece of trash jewelry that looked exactly like something a desperate boy might make as a promise he never expected to keep. If she was who he thought she was, then she had spent 20 years searching for him, just as he had spent 20 years trying to forget her. And if she wasn't, then Jinho was projecting his ghosts onto an innocent woman who just happened to be very good at her job. Either way, he couldn't look away from the monitors. Either way, the obsession had already consumed him. The agency manager treated Courtney like she was just a tool, not a human being. Some people think money gives them the right to ignore a person's soul. If you believe everyone deserves respect regardless of their job, comment, "Respect is mandatory," and subscribe to stand against toxic elitism. The recognition happened at 6:42 a.m. on the 7th day, and it destroyed Jinho's carefully constructed reality in the span of 3 seconds. He had been awake for 31 hours straight, cycling through surveillance footage with the kind of manic focus that his associates had learned to recognize as dangerous. When Jinho stopped sleeping, someone usually ended up dead. But this time, the violence was turning inward, a systematic dismantling of every assumption he had built his adult life upon. The security team had delivered the Incheon archives at 2 a.m., 16 terabytes of recovered footage from municipal cameras, harbor security systems, and traffic monitoring stations that had been operational in the mid-2000s. Most of it was corrupted, the digital files degraded by 2 decades of neglect and bureaucratic incompetence. But there were fragments. Enough fragments to confirm that, yes, there had been an orphanage near Dock 7. Yes, it had housed approximately 40 children at any given time. And yes, the facility had been shut down in 2007 after a financial scandal that had left the children scattered across the foster system like debris from an explosion. Jinho had found himself in exactly 4 clips. A skinny Korean boy with 2 sharp cheekbones and eyes that had already learned not to expect mercy. In 3 of the clips, he was alone, scavenging through dumpsters behind the fish market. But in the fourth, there was a girl. The image quality was terrible, the footage shot from a traffic camera positioned too far away to capture faces clearly. But Jinho could see them, 2 children sitting on a concrete piling, their legs dangling over dark water. The girl was handing something to the boy, food probably, though the resolution made it impossible to tell. And the boy was holding something up to the light, showing it to her. Something small. Something that caught the street light and glinted dull copper. Jinho had watched that 4-second clip 237 times. He had aged up the girl's face using software that cost more than most people's houses, had run the projection through every database he could access legally, and several he couldn't. The algorithm had given him a 73% probability match to Courtney Tolliver's current appearance, accounting for 20 years of aging and the fundamental changes that surviving poverty carved into a person's features. 73% wasn't certainty. It was maddening, statistically significant ambiguity. So he had returned to the live feeds, watching Courtney move through his house at dawn, preparing his coffee and organizing his newspapers and existing in that space of perfect professional invisibility that he now understood was armor, not training. She was in the kitchen. He watched her on camera 9, an angle that showed her in profile as she worked at the counter. She had arrived at 5:30 a.m., earlier than usual, and had spent the past hour preparing something that smelled, even through the building's ventilation system, like comfort food from a childhood Jinho had tried to amputate from his memory. Kimchi jjigae. The cheap kind, made with ingredients that cost almost nothing but tasted like someone gave a damn whether you survived the winter. Courtney stirred the pot with movements that suggested muscle memory, the kind of automatic grace that came from having made this dish 1,000 times. Steam rose around her face, and for a moment she looked softer, younger, like the girl in the grainy footage might look if she had been allowed to grow up safe. Then the sun crested the horizon. Dawn in Seoul was a violent thing in winter. The light came fast and sharp, cutting through the city's pollution like a blade. Jin-ho's kitchen faced east, floor-to-ceiling windows designed to showcase the view of the Han River and the mountains beyond. He rarely saw the sunrise. He was usually still awake from the previous night, or already at the office, or buried so deep in the fortress that natural light was an irrelevant concept. But Courtney was standing directly in its path. The sun hit the windows at exactly 6:42 a.m., flooding the kitchen with the kind of golden light that cinematographers spent fortunes trying to replicate. And Courtney, caught mid-motion as she reached for a bowl, became a figure in a painting Jin-ho would never be able to forget. The light hit her left hand. Jin-ho's breath stopped. He had been watching on camera 9, but he switched to camera 11, the overhead angle that gave him a direct view of her hands. Then he enhanced the image, zooming until the pixels started to fracture, until he could see every detail of the ring she wore on her fourth finger. Copper wire, twisted and clumsy, wrapped around itself in loops that had no symmetry, no elegance, no evidence of skill or practice. The work of someone who had never made jewelry before, who had only desperation and determination and a set of stolen pliers. But it was the specific pattern of the twist that stopped Jin-ho's heart. 3 loops around the base, then a spiral that crossed over itself twice before wrapping back down, then a final twist that secured a small piece of sea glass, green, translucent, roughly triangular, in a cage of wire that held it like a captured star. Jin-ho's hands were shaking. He opened a drawer in his desk, the bottom one, the one he never touched because touching it meant acknowledging what he had locked away. Inside was a small box, cedar wood, expensive in a way that betrayed how much he valued its contents. He opened it with fingers that felt numb. Inside was a single photograph, not the surveillance footage, not the aged-up projection, but a real photograph, printed on actual paper that had yellowed with time. He had stolen it from the orphanage's office the night before he ran away, had kept it hidden in his shoes and then his jacket, and then every apartment and house and fortress he had occupied since. The photograph showed 2 children, a Korean boy and a black girl, sitting on the floor of what looked like a storage room, playing cards with a deck that was missing half its numbers. The boy was maybe 12, rail-thin, with a bruise yellowing on his cheekbone. The girl was younger, 9 or 10, with hair in uneven braids and a smile that suggested she hadn't yet learned that smiling could be dangerous. And on the boy's hand, held up to show the camera, was a copper ring. Jin-ho had made it on a Tuesday. He remembered because Tuesdays were when the drunk dock worker usually passed out behind the warehouse, making his tools available for temporary theft. Jin-ho had taken pliers and wire cutters and a spool of electrical wire someone had left near the water. He had spent 4 hours twisting that wire, cutting his fingers in 3 places, learning through trial and error how to make something that looked like a promise instead of trash. The sea glass had been Courtney's contribution. She had found it on the beach, the narrow strip of contaminated sand where the orphanage sometimes took them on supervised walks that were more about free labor cleaning up debris than recreation. She had held it up to the light and said it looked like a jewel, like something a queen might wear. And Jin-ho, who had never given anyone anything in his entire life, had built a setting for her trash beach jewel and slipped it onto her finger. "I'll marry you when I'm rich," he had said, the Korean words clumsy in his mouth because he'd only been in the country for 2 years. "I promise, I'll come back with a real ring." She had laughed, not mockery, but delight. "Then don't forget me, Jin-ho, even when you're so rich you can buy the whole ocean." He had never bought the ocean, but he had bought everything else. Buildings and businesses and politicians, and enough power to ensure that no one would ever hurt him the way the orphanage had hurt him, the way poverty had hurt him, the way being powerless had hurt him every single day of his childhood. And he had forgotten her. Not intentionally, not cruelly, but the way you forget pain once you've amputated the limb, by necessity, by survival, by the fundamental rewiring of a brain that couldn't afford to remember what love felt like when love had been a liability. But she hadn't forgotten him. Jinho stared at the monitor, at the woman standing in his kitchen wearing a ring he had made with bleeding fingers and desperate hope. The sun had moved past its initial angle, but the light was still strong enough to make the sea glass glow. Green. Translucent. Exactly the shade of bottle glass that washed up on Incheon beaches, smoothed by salt water and time into something that almost looked precious. She had kept it. For 20 years, through everything, she had kept it. Jinho's hands moved without conscious thought, pulling up the personnel file he had already memorized. Courtney Tolliver, 32 years old, Nigerian-American, immigrated at age 8, mother deceased. Father deceased. That was new information, an update he hadn't noticed before. She was alone in the world. No family, no emergency contacts, just a string of employers who valued her ability to disappear. He did the math. If she had immigrated at 8 and she was 32 now, that meant she had arrived in Korea in 2002. The orphanage records showed a Courtney admitted in 2003, removed in 2007. 4 years. The same 4 years Jinho had been there, learning Korean and surviving and trying not to become the kind of person who would someday fire 12 people over a moved photograph. It was her. The probability wasn't 73%, it was 100%. The ring was proof. No one kept a piece of trash jewelry for 2 decades unless it meant everything. No one wore it to work, violating professional protocols and risking termination, unless it was the only thing tethering them to a version of themselves that still believed in promises. Jinho stood up from his desk so fast the chair crashed backward. He needed to what? Confront her. Demand an explanation. Ask her why she had come back, why she had taken a job cleaning his house instead of revealing herself, why she was moving through his life like a ghost when she was the only person he had ever. The thought completed itself before he could stop it, the only person he had ever loved. He was halfway to the door when the camera feed changed. Courtney had moved to the sink, washing the pot she had used for the stew. Her back was to the camera, but he could see her shoulders shaking, not from effort, from crying. Silent, controlled crying that she was managing around the rhythm of her work, tears falling into soapy water while she continued to scrub and rinse and perform the invisible labor that kept his fortress running. Jinho stopped moving. He watched her cry over his kitchen sink. This woman who had saved him when they were children, who had given him half her rice when she was starving, who had laughed at his clumsy promise instead of treating it like the desperate fantasy of a boy who had nothing. She had found him. After 20 years, she had found him. And instead of demanding recognition, instead of asking for the life he had promised, she had taken a job as his maid. She had made herself invisible in his house, had cleaned around his damage and organized his pain and fed him stew that tasted like someone remembered he was human. Why? The answer came with the clarity of a bullet, because she had seen what he had become. She had looked at Jinho, the Ice King of Seoul, the man who ruled through fear and isolation and calculated cruelty, and she had realized that the boy who made her a copper ring was dead. So she had come back not to claim him, but to mourn him. Jinho's reflection stared back at him from the darkened monitor screens. He saw what she must see. A man in a $5,000 suit, standing in an office designed to intimidate, surrounded by surveillance equipment that let him watch the world without participating in it. A man who had built a fortress to keep everyone out and called it empire. A man who had forgotten how to be the boy who believed a piece of wire and sea glass could be worth more than all the money in Seoul. Courtney finished washing the pot. She dried her hands on a towel, dried her face on her sleeve where the cameras couldn't see, and then she set a single bowl of stew on the counter, the place where Jinho always found his breakfast, prepared by invisible hands, offered without expectation of gratitude. She left the kitchen without looking back. And Jinho stood frozen in his office, staring at the monitors, holding a 20-year-old photograph in hands that had killed men and signed death warrants, and built an empire on the graves of everyone who had ever underestimated him. But those same hands had once twisted copper wire into a promise. And the woman who had believed that promise was crying in his house, invisible and unacknowledged, wearing his childhood vow like it still meant something. Jinho made a decision that would either save him or destroy everything he had built. He was going to make her see him again, Not the Ice King, not the Mafia boss, but the boy who had promised to come back. Even if he had to dismantle his entire empire to find him. The winter of 2005 tried to kill Jinho 3 times before he turned 13. The first attempt came in November, when the temperature dropped below freezing and stayed there for 6 days straight. The orphanage, a converted warehouse that smelled like rust and desperation, had heat for exactly 4 hours each evening, from 6 to 10 p.m. After that, the director turned off the boiler to save money, and the children learned to sleep in their clothes, sharing thin blankets in clusters of 3 or 4 because body heat was the only resource they had in abundance. Jinho didn't cluster. He had been at the orphanage for 2 years by then, long enough to understand that getting close to people meant giving them leverage, and leverage meant pain. So he slept alone in the corner farthest from the door, wrapped in a jacket he had stolen from a donation bin, and tried not to think about the fact that his toes had stopped hurting because they had gone numb 3 days ago. The second attempt came in December, when food became scarce enough that the older boys started hoarding, and the younger ones started stealing, and the whole fragile ecosystem of survival collapsed into violence. Jinho had learned to fight in his first month, learned that being small meant being fast, that being Korean in a facility that housed primarily international refugees meant being targeted, that winning wasn't about strength, but about being willing to go further than your opponent expected. He won most of his fights, but winning meant eating, and eating meant someone else didn't, and the math of survival was a zero-sum equation that carved itself into his bones. The third attempt came on January 17th, a Tuesday, when Jinho woke up and realized he couldn't remember the last time he had eaten a full meal. He had been rationing his portions for weeks, saving half of his breakfast rice to eat later, stretching his dinner soup with water from the bathroom tap, convincing his body that hunger was normal and fullness was the aberration. But even rationing had limits, and Jinho had reached his. His hands shook when he tried to hold his pencil during the mandatory schooling sessions the orphanage provided to maintain its government funding. His vision blurred at the edges, turning the world into a tunnel that kept narrowing. He was dying, slowly, incrementally, but dying nonetheless. That morning, Director Kwon, a man whose smile never reached his eyes and whose breath always smelled like soju, had made an announcement during breakfast. The orphanage was over capacity. Budget cuts meant reduced food allocations. Anyone who caused trouble, who complained, who failed to show proper gratitude for the charity they received, would be removed from the facility and placed elsewhere. No one asked where elsewhere was. They all knew. The streets. The shelters that were worse than streets. The systems designed to process children like defective products until they either aged out or disappeared. Jinho sat at the long table in the cafeteria, staring at his breakfast. A small bowl of rice porridge so thin he could see the bottom of the bowl through it, and a single piece of yellow radish kimchi that someone had cut in half because even pickled vegetables were now subject to rationing. He ate the kimchi first, forced himself to chew slowly to make it last, to pretend that the sharp tang of fermentation was satisfying instead of a reminder of everything he didn't have. Then he picked up his bowl and drank the porridge in 3 swallows, feeling it slide down his throat like water, providing no sustenance, no relief, just the brief illusion of having eaten. His stomach cramped, not from fullness, from the opposite. From the realization that this was all there was, that this would be all there was until dinner, and dinner would be the same thin gruel, the same mathematical impossibility of surviving on calories that couldn't support a body that was still trying to grow. Jinho stood up from the table, returned his bowl to the washing station, and walked out of the cafeteria with the kind of controlled calm that had become his default state. Show nothing, feel nothing, survive. He made it to the stairwell before his legs gave out. The stairs led to the 2nd floor, where the sleeping quarters were located, but Jinho never reached them. He sat down on the 3rd step, his back against the cold concrete wall, and tried to remember how to breathe through the dizziness. The world tilted sideways. His vision went gray at the edges, then darker, then. You're going to pass out if you keep holding your breath like that. Jinho's eyes snapped open. He hadn't heard anyone approach, which meant he was losing his edge, which meant he was more compromised than he thought. The girl was sitting 2 steps below him, looking up with an expression that wasn't quite concern, but wasn't indifference either. She was younger than Jinho, 9 or 10, maybe, with dark brown skin and hair pulled into braids that were starting to unravel at the ends. She wore the same donated clothes they all wore, layered and mismatched, sizes wrong, but she had somehow made them look intentional. A purple sweater over a green shirt over what might have been a dress or might have been a long tunic. Thick socks with cartoon characters on them, pulled up over her pants like leg warmers. Jinho recognized her, the new girl. She had arrived 2 months ago, placed by some international refugee organization after her mother died. The other kids said she was Nigerian, that she barely spoke Korean, that she cried at night when she thought no one was listening. But she wasn't crying now. She was looking at Jinho like he was a puzzle she was trying to solve. "I'm fine," Jinho said in Korean, his voice rougher than he intended. "You're not fine," she replied in English, then repeated in broken Korean. "Not fine, you. Hungry, too hungry." Jinho almost laughed. Too hungry. As if there was an acceptable level of hunger, a threshold you could stay safely below. Everyone's hungry. "Not same." She tilted her head, studying him with a kind of directness that made Jinho uncomfortable. People didn't usually look at him. They looked past him, through him, anywhere but directly at the person he was trying not to be. "You're dying hungry." The bluntness of it, delivered in her careful, accented Korean, hit harder than any insult. Because she was right. Jinho was dying. Maybe not today, maybe not this week, but soon. The math was clear. He stood up, or tried to. His legs didn't cooperate. The dizziness came back, stronger now, and he had to grab the railing to keep from falling. The girl stood up too, moving quickly despite her size. She grabbed his arm, not pulling, just steadying, and her hand was warm through his jacket. "Sit," she said, the Korean word firm. "Sit now." Jinho sat. He didn't have a choice. His body had made the decision for him. The girl disappeared for a moment, her footsteps quick on the stairs. Then she was back, holding something wrapped in a napkin. She sat down next to him on the step, closer than Jinho would normally allow, and unwrapped the napkin to reveal. Rice, a full portion of white rice, still steaming slightly, with a piece of fried egg on top. Jinho stared at it. "Where did you get that?" "Breakfast," she said it simply, as if it explained everything. I save for later." "That's yours." "Now yours." She held it out to him, the napkin balanced on her palm. "Eat." Jinho didn't move. He couldn't, because accepting food from someone meant owing them, and owing them meant debt, and debt was how people controlled you. He had learned that lesson in his first week. Never take what you can't pay back. But the girl wasn't acting like someone creating debt. She was acting like sharing food was the most natural thing in the world, like she hadn't just given away her only meal until dinner, like his survival mattered more than her own comfort. "Why?" Jinho asked. She looked confused by the question. "You need," she said in English, then switched to Korean. "You need eat, I see you. 3 days no eating right, you fall soon, maybe not get up." "You don't know me." "Don't need know." She pushed the napkin closer to him, insistent now. "Mama said," she stopped, her expression flickering with something that might have been grief. Then she continued in English, speaking slowly so he might understand. "My mama said when you see someone falling, you catch them, not think about it, not ask permission, just catch." Jinho took the food. His hands shook as he picked up the rice, and he hated that she could see how desperate he was, how close to collapse. But hunger was stronger than pride. Survival was stronger than shame. He ate slowly, forcing himself not to inhale it, not to make the mistake of eating too fast after days of near starvation. The rice was cold by now, but it tasted like the best thing he had ever eaten. The egg was perfect, fried until the edges were crispy, the yolk still slightly soft in the middle. The girl watched him eat with visible satisfaction, like his survival was a personal victory. When he finished, she took the napkin back, folded it carefully, and tucked it into her pocket to use again later. "Thank you," Jinho said, the Korean words feeling foreign in his mouth. He couldn't remember the last time he had thanked someone for anything. She smiled. It transformed her face, made her look younger and older at the same time. "You're welcome. Next time you ask me before you die, okay? Is easier." "There won't be a next time." "There's always next time." She said it with the certainty of someone who had survived enough to know. In places like this, always hungry, always cold, always need help, so we help each other or we don't make it. Jinho wanted to argue, to tell her that helping each other was a fantasy, that everyone was alone in the end. But the food was settling in his stomach, warmth spreading through his chest, and for the first time in days, he could think clearly enough to realize that maybe, just maybe, survival didn't have to be a solo equation. "What's your name?" he asked. "Courtney." She pronounced it carefully, the English sounds distinct from the Korean she had been speaking. "What yours?" "Jinho, de Jinho." "Jinho," she repeated, testing the syllables. "Good name, strong name." She stood up, brushing off her clothes. "I go now, you rest. Eat make you sleepy is okay. I tell Director Kwon you sick, need quiet." "You don't have to." "I know." She smiled again, that same transformative expression. "But I do anyway, that's how it works." She left him there on the stairs, and Jinho sat in the silence of the stairwell, feeling the food in his stomach and the warmth of someone else's kindness, and something shifted inside him. Not dramatically, not obviously, but enough that when he finally stood up and climbed the stairs to the sleeping quarters, he could feel the difference. He wasn't alone, not completely, not anymore. 3 weeks later, Jinho stole copper wire from the docks and twisted it into a ring that looked like garbage but meant everything. He gave it to Courtney on a Tuesday, the same day of the week she had saved his life with a napkin full of rice. She wore it on her fourth finger, left hand, and told him it was the most beautiful thing anyone had ever given her. "I'll marry you when I'm rich," Jinho had promised, the words spilling out before he could stop them. "I'll come back with a real ring, diamond, gold, whatever you want." Courtney had laughed, but gently, like she was laughing with him instead of at him. "Then don't forget me, Jinho, even when you're so rich you can buy the whole ocean." He had promised he wouldn't, had meant it with every piece of his desperate, starving, 13-year-old heart. And then he had forgotten anyway, not because he wanted to, but because remembering her meant remembering the boy who had needed saving, and that boy had to die for Jinho to be born. But she had remembered. For 20 years, through everything, she had remembered. And now she was in his house, wearing his promise, waiting for him to remember too. Jinho started with the candy on day 9, and it nearly broke him before it broke her. He had spent the previous night digging through memories he had sealed in concrete, excavating details from a past he had taught himself to think of as someone else's life. The candy had been called Apollo. Cheap strawberry chocolate treats sold in bright red boxes at every convenience store in Incheon. They cost 301 for a pack of 10, and Jinho and Courtney had stolen them religiously from the corner store 2 blocks from the orphanage. Not because they were hungry for sweets. The orphanage provided adequate calories, barely, and dessert was a luxury they had learned to live without. But stealing the candy had been a game, a small rebellion against a world that treated them like inventory. Courtney would distract the elderly shop owner with questions in her improving Korean, and Jinho would slip the box into his jacket with hands that had been learning to steal since before he learned to read. They would sit on the loading dock behind the warehouse, splitting the candies exactly in half, and for 20 minutes they would pretend they were normal children doing normal things, not refugees surviving on charity and stolen sugar. Jinho hadn't thought about Apollo candy in 15 years. But at 2 a.m. on day 9, he had his driver take him to an all-night convenience store in Gangnam, where he stood in the fluorescent lighting, surrounded by drunk businessmen and taxi drivers, searching the shelves like a man possessed. The packaging had changed. The box was smaller now, the design modernized, the price inflated to 801. But the candies inside were the same tiny round wafers layered with strawberry cream and cheap chocolate that melted too fast in your mouth. Jinho bought 40 boxes. The cashier looked at him like he was insane, this man in a suit that cost more than her monthly salary, buying out the store's entire stock of children's candy at 2 a.m. But she rang up the purchase without comment because people didn't question Jinho's behavior, not if they valued their employment. He brought the boxes home and sat in his office, staring at them like they were evidence in a case he was building against himself. Then he opened one box, ate a single candy, and felt the taste obliterate 20 years of carefully maintained distance. It tasted exactly the same: artificial strawberry, waxy chocolate, the kind of sweetness that existed only in childhood when you didn't know enough to want better. Jinho's hands shook as he sealed the box. Then he took it downstairs to the kitchen and left it on the counter where Courtney would find it when she arrived at 5:30 a.m. No note, no explanation, just the red box positioned exactly where she set his coffee every morning. He watched on camera 8 as she entered the kitchen at 5:27 a.m., 3 minutes early like always. Watched her go through her routine, checking the coffee maker, reviewing the day's schedule he left on the tablet, inventorying the refrigerator to plan his meals. She moved past the candy box twice without seeming to notice it. Then she stopped. Her whole body went rigid, like someone had pressed pause on her animation. She turned slowly, staring at the red box as if it had materialized from another dimension. Her hand reached out, hesitant, trembling slightly as she picked it up. She read the label, turned the box over, read it again. Then she opened it, and Jinho watched her face crack. Not dramatically. Courtney didn't collapse or cry out or do anything that would attract attention. But her professional mask slipped for exactly 4 seconds, and in those 4 seconds Jinho saw everything. Recognition, grief, hope, terror, and something that looked like prayers being answered and shattered simultaneously. She took out a single candy, held it up to the morning light streaming through the windows. The same gesture she used to make on the loading dock, examining each piece like it was treasure before she ate it. Then she put it back in the box, sealed it carefully, and set it back on the counter. She didn't eat it, didn't take it with her, just left it there and continued with her work as if nothing had happened. But Jinho had seen her hands shake as she made his coffee, had seen her pause 3 times while organizing his newspapers, staring at nothing, breathing like she was trying not to drown. She knew he knew. And she was still hiding. Jinho left the box there for 3 days. Each morning, Courtney would find it in the exact same position, and each morning she would stare at it for progressively longer periods, her composure eroding by increments. But she never took it, never acknowledged it, never broke the invisible barrier she had constructed between the woman she was now and the girl she used to be. On day 12, Jinho changed tactics. The orphanage had owned exactly 1 radio, a battered transistor model that someone had donated after it stopped working properly. It could only pick up 2 stations, a news channel that made everyone depressed, and a music station that played early 2000s K-pop on a loop. The children had fought over control of that radio like it was sacred territory, but Courtney and Jinho had developed a system. Tuesday and Thursday evenings were theirs, 7 to 8 p.m., when the dinner cleanup was finished and the mandatory study hour hadn't started yet. They would sit in the storage room where the radio lived, tuning it to the music station, and listen to songs they didn't understand sung by artists they would never meet. Jinho had been learning Korean. But the lyrics moved too fast, the slang too thick. So Courtney would translate, her English mixing with broken Korean, creating a hybrid language that belonged only to them. There was one song in particular. Jinho couldn't remember the artist or the title, but he remembered the chorus, something about promises and distance and coming back home. It had played at least twice every evening, the station's obvious favorite, and Courtney had loved it. She would close her eyes and sway slightly, mouthing words she barely understood, and for those 3 minutes she looked peaceful in a way she never looked the rest of the day. Jinho spent 6 hours searching for that song. He hired a music researcher, a woman who specialized in tracking down obscure recordings for wealthy collectors who had more money than Google skills. He gave her what he remembered. Early 2000s, K-pop, something about promises, played constantly on Incheon local radio around 2005. She found it in 40 minutes. Returned to Me by a group called Sia, released in 2004. Jinho listened to it once and felt his chest cave in. It was exactly as he remembered. Saccharine and earnest and completely sincere in a way that modern music had abandoned. The chorus was about waiting for someone who had promised to come back, about keeping faith even when faith seemed stupid, about love that persisted through separation. No wonder Courtney had loved it. It was their entire story, compressed into 3 minutes of overproduced pop. Jinho downloaded the song onto a small Bluetooth speaker, the expensive kind that produced crystal-clear sound despite its compact size. Then he placed the speaker in the library, hidden behind the books Courtney had reorganized by violence and meaning, and set it to play on a loop at low volume. He watched on camera 16 as she entered the library that afternoon for routine dusting. She didn't recognize it immediately. The first loop played while she was cleaning the windows, her back to the room, her focus on removing streaks that probably only she could see. But the second loop started just as she turned around, and Jinho saw the exact moment the melody registered. She dropped the cloth. It hit the floor without sound, and Courtney stood frozen in the center of the library, her head tilted like she was trying to determine if she was hallucinating. Then she followed the sound, tracking it to its source, moving slowly like someone approaching a trap. She found the speaker, picked it up with both hands, cradling it like it was fragile. The song kept playing, tinny and bright, and Courtney's face did something Jinho had never seen before. It collapsed inward, all her careful composure imploding into raw grief. She sank to the floor, still holding the speaker, and cried. Not silent tears this time, real crying. The kind that came from somewhere deep and old, that bent her forward until her forehead touched her knees, that shook her shoulders and made her breath come in gasps that Jinho could hear through the surveillance audio. She cried for the entire 3-minute song. Then the loop started again, and she cried through that too, and the next loop, and the one after that. Jinho watched from his office with his hand covering his mouth, trying not to make sound, trying not to acknowledge that he was crying too. Because this was what he had done to her. This was the weight of a promise kept by only one person, the cost of being the one who remembered when the other person chose to forget. Courtney cried until the song had played 12 times. Then she stood up slowly, carefully, like someone recovering from surgery. She set the speaker back where she had found it, making sure it was positioned exactly right. She picked up her cloth from the floor, and then she continued cleaning as if nothing had happened, even though her face was wet and her hands were shaking, and the song kept playing behind her like a ghost refusing to be ignored. Jinho switched off the monitor. He couldn't watch anymore, couldn't witness the systematic destruction of her defenses without acknowledging his own complicity in building them. But he didn't stop leaving breadcrumbs. On day 14, he left a pack of playing cards on the hallway table, the cheap kind with cartoon characters on them, missing the 2 of hearts and the 7 of clubs. The same cards they used to play with in the storage room, inventing rules because neither of them knew how actual card games worked. On day 16, he left a piece of sea glass on her cleaning cart, green, triangular, exactly the shape of the one embedded in her ring. On day 18, he left a photograph of the Incheon harbor docks, taken from the exact angle where they used to sit and watch the ships come in, imagining all the places those ships could take them if they were brave enough to stow away. Each breadcrumb destroyed her a little more. Jinho watched her find each one, watched her face crack and mend and crack again, watched her carry the weight of recognition through her work like she was performing surgery on her own heart. But she never broke character, never acknowledged the gifts, never deviated from her role as the invisible woman who existed only to serve. Jinho was starting to understand why. She wasn't hiding from him. She was protecting him from the truth of what he had become. She had looked at the Ice King of Soul and recognized the starving boy underneath, and she had made the choice that love makes when it's more generous than it should be. She had decided his survival mattered more than her acknowledgement. She would rather clean his house in silence than force him to confront the promise he had broken. But Jinho was done letting her protect him, done pretending he could survive in a fortress built on amnesia, done being the man who valued power more than the girl who had saved his life with a napkin full of rice. On day 19, while Courtney was out purchasing supplies, Jinho made a call to his intelligence network, the people he paid to know things that others wanted to keep hidden. "I need complete surveillance on my household staff," he said. "Specifically Courtney Tolliver. I want to know if anyone is watching her, if anyone has made the connection between her and me." The response came back in 6 hours. 3 of his rivals had already identified her. 2 had operatives tracking her movements. 1 had made preliminary inquiries about her family, her history, her vulnerabilities. They were going to use her against him. Of course they were. In Jinho's world, love was a weapon that his enemies would wield with surgical precision. He had 2 choices: send her away to protect her, or bring her closer to protect her differently. Jinho chose the third option. He would make sure everyone understood that Courtney Tolliver wasn't his weakness. She was his line in the sand. Jinho's rivals are already plotting to use his weakness against him. They represent a broken system that hates love. Don't let the villains win. Hit that like button to show that a promise is more powerful than a bullet. The summit was scheduled for day 23, and Jinho understood immediately that it was a trap disguised as diplomacy. The invitation had come through official channels, a formal request from the Seoul Syndicate Coalition for a reconciliation dinner to discuss territorial disputes and revenue sharing in the shipping corridors. 12 signatures at the bottom of the letter, each one representing a faction that would gladly watch Jinho bleed out on his own marble floors if they thought they could survive the retaliation. Jinho's advisors had counseled refusal. Hosting the dinner meant opening his fortress to enemies, meant allowing wolves into his home where they could count his exits and measure his defenses and look for weaknesses to exploit later. But refusing meant showing fear, and fear in his world was blood in water. It brought the sharks circling faster. So Jinho had accepted, because the Ice King of Seoul didn't refuse invitations. He controlled them. The dinner would be held in his formal dining room, a space he had never used because he didn't host social gatherings and didn't believe in breaking bread with people he might need to kill. The room was designed for intimidation rather than comfort. A 30-foot table of black walnut, chairs upholstered in leather the color of dried blood, walls lined with abstract art that looked like violence rendered in oil and canvas. Jinho had hired external staff for the event: security, servers, a chef who specialized in the kind of elaborate Korean-French fusion cuisine that Seoul's elite expected at gatherings where everyone was sizing each other up for future funerals. But the night before the dinner, his head of security had informed him that 2 of the hired servers had background connections to rival factions, not enough to justify termination, but enough to suggest that information would flow both ways. Jinho had fired them anyway, which left him short-staffed with 12 hours' notice. Use the regular household staff, his advisor had suggested. You have a maid, she can serve. Jinho had said yes before he fully processed the implications, and now it was too late to reverse the decision without drawing attention to Courtney's significance. So she would serve dinner to 12 men who ran Seoul's underworld, and Jinho would have to watch her move through a room full of predators while pretending she meant nothing to him. The preparation began at noon. Courtney had received her instructions from the catering manager, a severe woman named Ms. An who treated serving as a military operation requiring precision and absolute obedience. Jinho watched on the monitors as Ms. An walked Courtney through the protocols: how to hold the serving trays, which side to approach from, when to pour wine, and when to step back into invisibility. Courtney absorbed the instructions with the same focused attention she brought to everything, nodding at appropriate intervals, practicing the movements until they became muscle memory. She had changed into formal serving attire, a black dress with a white apron, the universal uniform of domestic invisibility. Her hair was pulled back even more severely than usual, and she wore no makeup, nothing that would make her memorable or distinct. She looked like exactly what she was pretending to be: a servant whose job was to facilitate the comfort of important men while remaining beneath their notice. But Jinho noticed. He noticed the way her hands trembled slightly as she practiced carrying the heavy serving trays, noticed the way she kept touching the ring on her left hand, spinning it unconsciously whenever Ms. An's attention was elsewhere. Noticed the careful blankness of her expression, the kind of studied neutrality that came from years of making herself invisible to people who had power over her survival. The guests began arriving at 7 p.m., each one stepping out of armored vehicles with security details that bristled with barely concealed weapons. Jinho greeted them in the foyer with the cold politeness that passed for warmth in his world, shaking hands with men who had ordered hits on his associates, accepting compliments on his home from people who were mentally cataloging every security feature for future reference. Kwon Yi-sung arrived first, a real estate developer who laundered money through property deals and had once sent Jinho a bouquet of white chrysanthemums, the flowers used at Korean funerals. The message had been clear: I'm preparing for your death. Jinho had sent back a mirror, gift-wrapped. The message had been clearer: keep looking at yourself because you're next. They shook hands like old friends. Choi Min-seo came next, a woman in her 50s who ran the pharmaceutical supply chain and treated human life like a commodity to be priced according to demand. She wore diamonds that had probably been payment for someone's medical debt, and her smile had the warmth of a surgical instrument. Then came the others. Go Taeyong, who controlled the gambling networks. Yoon Sang-min, who specialized in corporate espionage. Directors and underbosses and fixers who had built empires on exploitation and called it business. And finally, Hwang De-young, who entered last because men like him always needed to make an entrance. Hwang was Jin-ho's primary rival, a second-generation crime lord who had inherited his father's organization and spent the past decade trying to prove he deserved it. He was younger than Jin-ho by 3 years, but acted older, affecting the mannerisms of old-school bosses who believed respect was earned through brutality rather than strategy. He wore a suit that cost more than most cars and an expression that suggested he found everything faintly amusing, including his own capacity for violence. His wife accompanied him, a detail that made Jin-ho's jaw tighten. Spouses weren't typically included in business dinners, but Hwang had brought Seo-yeon anyway, a calculated provocation disguised as domesticity. She was beautiful in the way that Seoul's elite wives were beautiful, surgically enhanced, expensively maintained, decorative rather than functional. She wore a dress that probably cost more than Courtney earned in a year, and she looked at Jin-ho's fortress with the kind of appraisal that suggested she was already redecorating it in her mind. They moved to the dining room at 7:30, taking their assigned seats with the careful choreography of people who understood that seating arrangements were power maps. Jin-ho sat at the head of the table, Hwang at the opposite end, the others distributed according to alliance and rivalry in a configuration that Ms. An had spent 3 hours perfecting. Courtney entered from the kitchen door, carrying the first course. Jin-ho forced himself not to watch her too closely, not to track her movements the way he had been tracking them for 23 days. But his peripheral vision caught everything. The way she moved along the wall, approaching each guest from their left side exactly as Ms. An had instructed. The way she set down each plate with silent precision, her hands steady despite the weight of the serving tray. The guests didn't look at her. She was staff beneath notice, part of the furniture that facilitated their comfort. They continued their conversation, small talk about real estate markets and shipping delays, the kind of coded discussion that was really about territory and profit margins. But Hwang's wife looked. Seo-yeon's eyes followed Courtney as she moved around the table, and something in her expression shifted from boredom to interest. She leaned toward her husband and whispered something Jin-ho couldn't hear. Hwang glanced at Courtney, then away, but the seed had been planted. The first course was consumed with appropriate compliments to the absent chef. Courtney cleared the plates with the same silent efficiency, and Jin-ho allowed himself to believe that perhaps this would be fine, that she would remain invisible, that the evening would end without incident. Then the second course arrived, and everything started to unravel. Courtney was serving the main dish, some elaborate preparation of beef and root vegetables that the chef had spent 6 hours creating. She had made it around half the table when Kwon Yi-sung, drunk on expensive wine and his own sense of importance, shifted his chair backward just as Courtney was approaching. The chair hit her hip, not hard enough to knock her over, but hard enough to throw off her balance. The serving tray tilted, and for one horrible second Jin-ho thought everything was going to crash to the floor. But Courtney recovered, her reflexes sharp from years of anticipating disaster. She steadied the tray, adjusted her stance, and continued serving as if nothing had happened. Kwon didn't apologize, didn't even acknowledge what he had done. He just continued his conversation with the man next to him, secure in the knowledge that the help didn't require consideration. Jin-ho's hands tightened on his chopsticks. He forced himself to breathe normally, to maintain the expression of mild interest he had been wearing all evening. But under the table, his leg was bouncing with barely suppressed rage. Courtney finished serving and retreated to the kitchen. The dinner continued. The guests ate and drank and conducted their coded negotiations, and Jin-ho participated in all of it while a timer ticked down in his head, counting the minutes until he could end this performance and ensure that Courtney was safe. The third course came and went without incident. Then the fourth. Jin-ho started to relax, started to believe that they might actually make it through the evening without. "Tell me, Jin-ho," Hwang said, his voice cutting through the ambient conversation. "Where did you find such an exotic addition to your staff?" The table went quiet. Every person in the room understood that H. Wang didn't make idle observations, that questions like this had purposes that wouldn't become clear until it was too late. Jinho took a sip of his water, buying time. "Through an agency, the same way everyone finds competent staff." H. Wang smiled, the expression not reaching his eyes. "She's quite striking, don't you think so, darling?" He directed the question to his wife, who perked up like she had been waiting for her cue. "Oh yes, very unusual. You don't often see African women working in domestic service here. I wonder what her story is." "Her story is that she's employed," Jinho said, his tone flat. "Nothing more interesting than that." But Sioyon wasn't finished. She turned in her seat as Courtney entered to clear the fourth-course plates, and this time she addressed her directly. "Excuse me, you there." Courtney stopped, her professional mask firmly in place. "Yes, ma'am." "What's your name?" Jinho watched Courtney's throat work as she swallowed. "Courtney Tolliver, ma'am." "American?" "Yes, ma'am." "How did you end up working for Mr. Duh?" Sioyon's tone was light, conversational, but Jinho could hear the trap being set. "It must be quite different from what you're used to." "I go where the work is, ma'am." Courtney's voice was perfectly neutral, giving nothing away. "Of course." Sioyon smiled, and it was the smile of a woman who had found a weakness and was deciding how best to exploit it. "That's a very interesting ring you're wearing. Is it traditional from your country?" Courtney's hand moved unconsciously to cover the copper ring, and Jinho felt his blood pressure spike. This was it. This was the moment when everything could collapse, when Courtney's carefully maintained invisibility would shatter under scrutiny designed to humiliate. "It's personal, ma'am," Courtney said quietly. "Personal?" Sioyon drew out the word, tasting it. "How sweet. And yet you wear it while serving at a formal dinner. Most staff are trained to remove personal items during service. Don't you think that's unprofessional?" The question hung in the air like poison gas. Every person at the table was now watching Courtney, analyzing her response, cataloging this interaction for future use. Jinho could see the calculation happening in real time. The Ice King has a maid who breaks protocol. The Ice King allows this breach. Therefore, the maid matters. Therefore, the maid is leverage. Courtney met Sioyon's eyes with a dignity that made Jinho's chest ache. "I apologize if my appearance is unsatisfactory, ma'am. I'll ensure it doesn't happen again." She was backing down, giving them what they wanted, accepting the humiliation as the price of continued invisibility. Jinho opened his mouth to intervene, to shut down this line of attack before it escalated, but H. Wang spoke first. Now, darling, don't be cruel." He said it with mock sympathy, as if he was defending Courtney rather than participating in her degradation. "I'm sure Mr. Duh's staff are allowed some personal expression. After all, it's not as if she's family. She's just the help." The words landed like punches. Just the help. As if Courtney was disposable. As if 20 years of carrying a copper ring meant nothing because the person wearing it didn't have power. Jinho watched Courtney's face remain perfectly neutral, watched her absorb the insult without flinching, and something inside him snapped. Not visibly, not yet, but internally, in the place where he kept his capacity for mercy, something fundamental shifted. These people, these cruel, small-minded people who thought money gave them the right to humiliate someone whose worth they couldn't begin to measure, were going to learn a lesson about the difference between power and value. But not tonight. Tonight, he had to maintain control, had to let Courtney finish her service, had to survive this dinner without revealing that the woman they were mocking was the only reason he had survived long enough to become someone they feared. "Courtney," Jinho said, his voice carrying across the table, "you may return to the kitchen. We'll handle our own service for the remainder of the evening." It was a dismissal, but also protection, getting her out of the room before things escalated further. Courtney bowed slightly and retreated, her spine straight, her dignity intact despite everything. The dinner continued for another hour, but Jinho barely tasted the food. He was too busy planning the retaliation that would come later, the systematic dismantling of everyone who had participated in tonight's casual cruelty. But first, he had a promise to keep. A promise he had made 20 years ago to a girl who had saved his life with half a bowl of rice. A promise that was more powerful than any bullet, any threat, any empire he could build. He was going to marry her. And everyone who had mocked her ring was going to watch. The incident happened during dessert service, and it happened so fast that Jinho almost missed it. Almost. Courtney had remained in the kitchen after Jinho's dismissal, helping the catering staff with cleanup despite his instruction that she could leave. He had watched her on the monitors, moving through the kitchen with mechanical efficiency, washing dishes that didn't need washing, organizing supplies that were already organized. She was avoiding the dining room, avoiding the guests, avoiding the humiliation that still hung in the air like smoke. But Ms. An had other ideas. The catering manager was a woman who believed in protocol above all else, and protocol dictated that dessert was the responsibility of household staff, not external contractors. So she had sent Courtney back into the dining room with a tray of coffee and a crystal decanter of expensive cognac, ignoring Courtney's quiet protest that Mr. De had released her from service. Jinho saw Courtney re-enter the dining room at 9:47 p.m., her face composed but her movements slightly stiff, like someone walking into enemy territory without backup. The guests were louder now, alcohol having eroded whatever restraint they had started the evening with. Laughter echoed off the walls, the kind of laughter that came from men who felt powerful and untouchable, who believed their money and connections gave them immunity from consequences. Courtney moved along the wall, approaching each guest with coffee service. She had made it 3/4 of the way around the table when she reached Hwang De-young and his wife. Hwang waved away the coffee with an impatient gesture, not looking at Courtney, already deep in conversation with a man to his left about shipping routes and payoff structures. But Seo-yeon held up her cup, smiling that same calculating smile she had worn earlier when she asked about the ring. "Coffee, please," she said sweetly. "And perhaps you can tell me more about that fascinating jewelry you're wearing." Courtney poured the coffee with steady hands, her voice professionally neutral. "There's nothing to tell, ma'am." "Oh, but I think there is." Seo-yeon leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was still loud enough for half the table to hear. "It's quite unusual to see someone wearing such sentimental trash while serving at a formal dinner. Most people would have the good sense to leave their personal items at home, but perhaps you didn't have anywhere safe to store it." The implication was clear. Courtney was too poor to have a real home, too transient to have a place to keep her belongings secure. It was a perfectly calibrated insult, wrapped in concern, designed to humiliate while maintaining plausible deniability. Courtney set down the coffee pot on the serving cart, her jaw tight. "If you'll excuse me, ma'am." "Wait." Seo-yeon's hand shot out, grabbing Courtney's wrist, not hard enough to hurt but firm enough to stop her movement to assert dominance. "Let me see it up close. I'm fascinated by folk jewelry." The term hung in the air like a slur. Folk jewelry. As if Courtney's ring was some primitive artifact from a culture Seo-yeon considered beneath her, rather than what it actually was. A promise made by a desperate boy to a girl who had saved his life. Jinho's hands gripped the arms of his chair so tightly the wood creaked. Several guests had stopped their conversations now, turning to watch the interaction with the kind of interest people showed when they sensed blood in the water. Courtney tried to pull her hand back, but Seo-yeon held firm, pulling Courtney's hand into the light so everyone could see the copper ring, the twisted wire, the piece of sea glass that caught the chandelier's glow and transformed it into something that looked almost precious. "How charming," Seo-yeon said, her tone dripping with condescension. "Did you make this yourself, or was it a gift from," she paused, letting the implication build, "someone equally resourceful?" "Ma'am, I really need to." "I'm just trying to understand," Seo-yeon continued, her voice taking on an edge now, the pretense of kindness evaporating. "Why someone would wear garbage to work. Why someone would think that a piece of twisted wire and beach trash qualifies as jewelry. Why someone would be so desperate to pretend they're worth something that they'd parade their poverty like it's an accomplishment." The words landed like physical blows. Jinho watched Courtney's face, watched her absorb each insult with the practiced stoicism of someone who had been surviving this kind of cruelty her entire life. But her eyes showed everything. Pain, rage, And underneath it all, a deep exhaustion with the world's insistence on measuring worth in money rather than meaning. "It was a gift," Courtney said quietly, her voice steady despite the tremor Jinho could see running through her shoulders. "From someone important." "Important?" Seoyeon laughed, and it was the ugliest sound Jinho had heard all evening. "Darling, if they were important, they would have given you real jewelry, gold, diamonds, something that proved you mattered. This," she gestured at the ring with visible disgust, "this just proves you'll accept scraps and call it love." Something in Courtney's expression shifted. Not anger exactly, but a kind of crystalline clarity, as if Seoyeon had finally said the thing that made everything else make sense. "You're wrong," Courtney said, and for the first time all evening, she didn't add "ma'am" at the end. Seoyeon's eyes widened, affronted by the absence of deference. "Excuse me." "This ring is worth more than anything you're wearing," Courtney said, her voice still quiet but carrying a weight that made several guests lean forward to hear better. "Because it was made by someone who had nothing and gave me everything anyway. Your diamonds were bought with money you didn't earn from a man who doesn't love you. My ring was made with bleeding hands by a boy who thought I was worth saving. So no, ma'am, with all due respect, you're wrong." The silence that followed was absolute. Jinho stopped breathing. Every person at the table had frozen, watching this confrontation between a wealthy man's wife and a maid who had just committed the cardinal sin of talking back, of asserting her own worth in a space designed to deny it. Seoyeon's face went through several colors, shock, rage, humiliation, before settling on something cold and calculated. She released Courtney's wrist and stood up so fast her chair scraped backward. "How dare you?" she hissed. "Do you know who I am? Do you have any idea what I could do to you with one phone call?" "I know exactly who you are," Courtney replied, and Jinho could hear 20 years of survival in her voice, 20 years of learning to read people's cruelty like it was her first language. "You're someone who needs other people to feel small so you can feel big, but making me feel small doesn't make you important. It just makes you sad." Wang stood up now, his hand on his wife's arm, his expression thunderous. "Jinho," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "Your staff just insulted my wife, in your home, at your dinner table. I think an apology is warranted, immediately." All eyes turned to Jinho. This was the moment that would define everything. The moment where he could either maintain his carefully cultivated reputation by disciplining Courtney, by forcing her to apologize to people who had degraded her, by choosing his empire over the girl who had saved him. Or he could burn it all down. Jinho opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, Seoyeon moved. It happened so fast that Jinho's security training was the only reason he saw it at all. Seoyeon stepped forward as if she was going to say something else, but her foot shot out at the last second, hooking behind Courtney's ankle. Courtney stumbled, her balance already compromised by the serving cart behind her. She tried to catch herself on the table edge, but Seoyeon's follow-through was too perfect, too practiced. This was not the first time she had used physical intimidation to put someone in their place. Courtney fell. Not hard enough to injure, but hard enough to land on her knees on the marble floor, hard enough that her hand slammed against the table leg, hard enough that the copper ring, the ring she had worn for 20 years, the ring she had kept safe through everything, flew off her finger and skittered across the floor. It rolled in a perfect arc, catching the light, spinning like a tiny prayer, and disappeared into the heating vent in the corner of the room. Gone. The sound Courtney made was barely audible, a small, broken gasp that Jinho felt in his chest like a knife. She scrambled to the vent, dropping to her hands and knees, not caring that she was now on the floor in front of 12 of Seoul's most powerful criminals, not caring that her dignity was in shreds, caring only about the ring. Her ring, their ring. "No, no, 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 no," she whispered, her hands scrabbling at the vent grate, trying to pry it open with her bare fingers. "Please, please." Seoyeon stood over her, arms crossed, satisfaction radiating from every line of her body. "How clumsy," she said, her voice saccharine. "I do hope that wasn't irreplaceable, though I suppose garbage can always be replaced with more garbage." Then she said something else, a word Jinho had heard before, a racial slur that had no place in any language, that reduced Courtney's entire existence to the color of her skin and the poverty of her circumstances. She said it clearly, deliberately, with the confidence of someone who believed money had purchased immunity from consequence. The word hit Courtney like a physical blow. Jinho watched her freeze, watched her stop trying to reach the ring, watched her fold into herself like she was trying to become invisible one final time. And something inside Jinho, something that had been carefully controlled and strategically deployed and weaponized into the foundation of his empire, finally, completely shattered. He stood up. The movement was so abrupt that several guests reached for weapons that weren't there, their instincts recognizing danger even if their rational minds couldn't yet identify its source. "Get out," Jinho said. Wang blinked. "What?" "Get out." Jinho's voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of every kill he had ordered, every enemy he had destroyed, every line he had drawn that no one had survived crossing. "Take your wife, take your insults, take your presence, and leave my home before I forget we're supposed to be allies." "Jinho, you're overreacting." "I'm going to count to 3, Jinho said, and his tone was so devoid of emotion it was somehow more terrifying than shouting would have been. "At 3, if you're still in my house, I'm going to kill her." He nodded toward Seoyeon. Not quickly, not cleanly, but permanently. 1. The room erupted into chaos. Wang's face went purple with rage. Several other guests stood, either to intervene or to distance themselves from the confrontation. Security moved toward the doors, uncertain whether they were supposed to be protecting Jinho or protecting everyone else from Jinho. "You're insane," Wang spat. "Over a maid, over a piece of trash jewelry, you're willing to start a war over." 2. Wang grabbed his wife's arm and pulled her toward the door. The other guests followed, some rushing, some maintaining dignity, all of them understanding that Jinho had just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Within 90 seconds, the dining room was empty except for Jinho, Courtney, and the security detail that stood frozen at their posts, unsure what protocol said about their boss dropping to his knees on a marble floor. Because that's exactly what Jinho did. He walked to where Courtney knelt in front of the heating vent, tears streaming down her face, her fingers bloody from trying to pry open the metal grate. He dropped to his knees beside her, this man who never knelt, who never bowed, who had built an entire identity on being untouchable, and put his hand over hers. "Stop," he said gently. "You're hurting yourself." "I can't, I have to, it's the only," Courtney's words dissolved into sobs. "It's the only thing I have from him. From before, I can't lose it. I can't." "You didn't lose it," Jinho said. "It's right here, I'm right here." Courtney looked at him then, really looked at him, and Jinho saw the moment recognition finally, fully landed. Not suspicion, not hope, but certainty. "Jinho," she whispered. "I'm sorry," he said, and his voice cracked on the words. "I'm so sorry I forgot. I'm sorry I made you wait. I'm sorry I let them hurt you. I'm sorry I became someone you had to hide from instead of someone you could trust." "You came back," Courtney said, like she couldn't quite believe it. "You actually came back." "I never left," Jinho said. "I just lost myself trying to become someone who couldn't be hurt, but you found me anyway." He turned to the nearest security guard. "Get me a screwdriver, get me a flashlight, get me whatever I need to take this entire vent apart." "Sir, we can call maintenance." "Now," Jinho said, and the guard ran. Jinho turned back to Courtney, taking her bleeding hands in his. "I'm getting your ring back, our ring, and then I'm keeping the promise I made 20 years ago." "Jinho, you don't have to." "Yes," he said, "I do." The security guard returned with a toolbox in under 3 minutes, but to Jinho, it felt like hours. He knelt on the marble floor beside Courtney, who had stopped crying but remained frozen in place, her bleeding fingers still resting against the vent grate-like she was afraid that removing them would make the ring disappear entirely. Behind them, Jinho's personal security detail stood in uncomfortable silence, uncertain whether they were witnessing their boss having a breakdown or undergoing some kind of transformation. They didn't have the emotional vocabulary to name. Jinho took the screwdriver from the guard without looking up. His hands that had signed death warrants without trembling, that had held guns steady while ending lives, that had built an empire through calculated violence, shook as he positioned the tool against the first screw. "Sir," his head of security said carefully, Perhaps we should evacuate the staff first. Wang won't take this insult quietly. He'll retaliate. We need to secure the perimeter and... I don't care about the perimeter, Jinho said, twisting the screwdriver. The screw was old, painted over, resistant. I don't care about Wang. I don't care about retaliation. I care about getting this ring back. Sir, with all respect, it's just... Jinho's head snapped up, and the look he gave his security chief made the man take 2 steps backward. Finish that sentence and you're fired. It's not just anything, it's everything. The security chief fell silent. Jinho returned to the vent, working the first screw free with grinding patience. The metal was corroded, the threads stripped from years of paint and neglect. This vent had probably never been opened, had probably never needed to be opened, because who would have imagined that the Ice King of Seoul would someday be on his knees trying to retrieve a piece of copper wire worth less than the screwdriver he was using? The first screw came free. Jinho moved to the second one, his focus narrowing to this single task, this one act of recovery that felt more important than any deal he had ever closed or any enemy he had ever eliminated. Courtney watched him work, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Jinho, you don't have to do this. I can call a maintenance person tomorrow. I can. No, the word came out harder than he intended. He softened his voice. No, I'm not waiting. I'm not delegating. I'm doing this myself because 20 years ago I put that ring on your finger with my own hands, and I'm not trusting anyone else to get it back. But your guests left, and good riddance. The second screw resisted, the head partially stripped. Jinho adjusted his angle, applying pressure that made his knuckles white. They're not my guests. They're parasites who mistake cruelty for power. And I just realized I've spent 20 years becoming exactly like them. That's not true, Courtney said quietly. You built something, you survived, you became. I became someone you had to hide from. The second screw finally gave way, clattering to the marble floor. I became someone so terrifying that the girl who saved my life thought she needed to serve me in silence rather than remind me I used to be human. I wasn't hiding from you, Courtney said. I was protecting you. I saw what you'd become, the power you built, the empire you controlled. And I thought if I showed up demanding recognition, demanding the promise you'd made, I would destroy everything you'd worked for. So I decided it was enough just to be near you, to take care of you the only way you'd let me. Jinho paused, the screwdriver frozen against the third screw. You took a job as my maid to protect me. I took a job as your maid because it was the only way to be close to you without threatening your carefully constructed walls. Courtney's voice was steady now, the tears drying on her face. I watched you for 2 years before I applied to that agency. Watched you build higher and higher walls, watched you isolate yourself, watched you turn into someone who thought being alone was the same as being safe. And I thought if I could just take care of you, just make your house feel less like a fortress and more like a home, maybe the boy I knew would start remembering he existed. The third screw came out easily, as if the vent itself had decided to surrender. Jinho moved to the fourth corner, his hands steadier now, his purpose crystallized into something he could execute with the precision that had made him legendary in his world. I did remember, he said, working the final screw. The moment I saw your ring, I remembered everything. Every meal you shared with me when you were hungry too. Every time you stood between me and the older kids who wanted to hurt me. Every conversation we had about who we'd be when we grew up, when we were safe, when we were somewhere the world couldn't hurt us anymore. You remembered and you left breadcrumbs, Courtney said, and there was wonder in her voice. The candy, the song, the playing cards, you were testing me. I was trying to make you remember me too. The final screw released. Jinho set down the screwdriver and carefully lifted the vent grate. The opening was dark, the shaft descending into shadows. He pulled out his phone, turned on the flashlight, and angled it into the vent. There, about 2 feet down, caught on a seam where the vertical shaft met a horizontal duct, was the copper ring. The sea glass caught the light and threw it back in shades of green that looked like hope rendered visible. Jinho reached into the vent, his arm disappearing up to his shoulder. His fingers stretched, grasping for purchase in the narrow space. He could feel the rough metal scraping against his expensive suit jacket, could feel dust and decades of accumulated debris coating his skin, and none of it mattered. His fingers brushed the ring. It shifted, sliding further down the shaft. No, Jinho breathed, extending his arm until his shoulder was pressed flat against the floor, until he was stretched out like he was trying to reach into the past itself. His fingers closed around the wire, careful not to crush it, careful to respect the fragility of something that had survived 20 years only to nearly be lost in a single moment of cruelty. He pulled his arm out slowly, his hand closed in a fist, and when he opened it, the copper ring sat in his palm exactly as he remembered it. Tarnished. Clumsy. Perfect. Courtney made a sound that was half sob, half laugh. Jinho held the ring up to the light, examining it with the same focus he brought to analyzing contracts worth billions. The wire was twisted in the exact pattern his 13-year-old hands had created, 3 loops at the base, a spiral that crossed over itself twice, then a final twist securing the sea glass in its wire cage. The sea glass itself was scratched, one corner chipped from decades of wear. But it still caught the light the same way it had on the Inshan beach when Courtney had held it up and said it looked like a jewel. It's still beautiful, Jinho said. It's garbage, Courtney replied, but she was smiling through fresh tears. Literal garbage, wire and beach trash. It's a promise. Jinho looked at her directly, and for the first time in 20 years he let her see all of him, not the Ice King, not the Mafia boss, but the boy who had twisted this ring with bleeding hands because he had nothing else to give except his intention to survive long enough to deserve her. It's the only promise I ever meant to keep. He took her left hand, the one with bloody fingers from trying to pry open the vent, and slipped the ring back onto her 4th finger. It settled into the groove it had worn in her skin over 20 years, fitting like it had never left. There, Jinho said, back where it belongs. Courtney looked at the ring, then at Jinho, then back at the ring. What happens now? You just threatened to kill a rival boss's wife over me. You just kicked out everyone who runs Seoul's underworld. You just chose a maid over maintaining the alliances that keep your empire stable. I didn't choose a maid over my empire, Jinho said. I chose you over an empire that required me to forget you existed. There's a difference. Jinho, they'll come after you, after us. H-Wang won't let this stand. None of them will. Let them come. Jinho stood up, pulling Courtney to her feet with him. I've spent 20 years building walls to keep everyone out. I'm done hiding. I'm done pretending that power is the same thing as safety. I'm done being the Ice King when all I ever wanted was to be the person who came back for you. Behind them, the security detail exchanged glances. This was unprecedented territory. Their boss, kneeling on the floor over a copper ring, declaring war on his own alliances for a woman he'd never mentioned before tonight. They didn't know how to protect him from this. Didn't know if protection was even what he needed anymore. One of the guards cleared his throat. Sir, I'm receiving reports that H-Wang's detail is mobilizing. They're calling in reinforcements. It looks like they're preparing for a war, Jinho finished. I know, I just started one. Sir, if we're going into conflict, we need to secure the compound, evacuate non-essential personnel, establish defensive positions. Jinho held up a hand, stopping the tactical recitation. He was still holding Courtney's hand, the one with the ring, and he could feel her pulse racing against his palm. Everyone leaves except essential security, but Courtney stays. Sir, if she stays, she's a target. They'll use her too. They'll try, Jinho said, and his voice carried the weight of every violent thing he was capable of. And they'll learn why I'm called the Ice King, not because I'm cold, because I'm the kind of cold that burns, the kind that destroys everything it touches when something I love is threatened. He turned to Courtney, his expression softening. I need you to understand what you're choosing if you stay. This won't be quiet. This won't be safe. Everything I've built, everything I've become, it's all going to be tested. They're going to try to hurt me. They're going to use every weapon they have to prove that love is weakness. And what do you believe? Courtney asked. Is love weakness? Jinho thought about the boy who had made a ring from stolen wire. Thought about the girl who had shared her only meal with a starving stranger. Thought about 20 years of surviving separately when they could have been surviving together. Love is the only thing I've ever done that wasn't about fear, he said. Every wall I built, every person I hurt, every alliance I made, it was all about being too terrifying to hurt. But loving you, that was never about fear. That was about believing that somewhere in this world, someone thought I was worth saving. Courtney's eyes filled with tears again, but she was smiling. So what happens now? Now, Jinho pulled her closer, and somewhere in the fortress, alarms were beginning to sound as his security systems detected incoming threats. Now I keep my promise. I marry you. Not someday when it's safe. Not after I've neutralized every threat. Now, today, because I've already waited 20 years too long. Jinho, we can't get married in the middle of a war. Watch me. He turned to his head of security. Get me a priest. Get me whatever official needs to be bribed to issue a marriage license in the middle of the night. Get me witnesses who won't run when the shooting starts. Sir, this is insane. This is the sanest thing I've done in 20 years. Jinho looked at Courtney. And his expression was everything the Ice King never allowed himself to show. Vulnerability, hope, desperate love. I built an empire because I thought that's what power looked like. But you shared your rice when you were starving. You wore my trash ring for 20 years. You came back for me even when I'd become a monster. That's power. That's the empire I should have been building all along. Outside, the first shots were fired. The security system registered impacts on the perimeter wall, warning shots, probably, meant to announce H. Wang's intentions before the real assault began. Inside, Da Jinho stood in his dining room, holding hands with a woman wearing a copper ring. And for the first time in 20 years, he felt like the boy who believed promises were more powerful than bullets. So, he asked, will you marry me again, properly this time? Courtney looked at the ring on her finger, then at Jinho, then at the security details scrambling to defensive positions as the world outside prepared to tear them apart. Yes, she said, but only if you promise one thing. Anything. Promise me you won't forget again. Promise me that no matter how big the empire gets, no matter how many walls you build, you'll remember that the boy who made this ring is more important than the king who rules Seoul. Jinho pulled her into his arms, holding her like she was the only thing tethering him to his humanity. I promise, he said. And this time, I'm not forgetting, even if I have to burn down everything I built to remember. Jinho just risked his entire empire to protect a piece of wire and the woman who wore it. Would you have gone that far, or would you have stayed safe in your seat? If you would choose love over power, subscribe and tell us. Love is the real empire. Courtney tried to leave at 3:47 a.m., and Jinho caught her in the hallway with a single duffel bag and guilt written across her face like a confession. The firefight had ended 2 hours earlier, not because anyone won, but because both sides had exhausted their initial ammunition and rage, retreating to regroup and plan more strategic assaults. Jinho's fortress had held, the reinforced walls and automated defenses doing exactly what he had paid obscene amounts of money to ensure they would do. But the message had been received on both sides. This was no longer a business dispute. This was personal. This was war. 13 security personnel had been injured, none fatally. The exterior walls bore scars from bullets and small explosives. 3 armored vehicles had been disabled in the driveway, and somewhere in Seoul, H. Wang Diyong was either planning Jinho's murder or his own defense, depending on which of them moved faster. Jinho had spent the past 2 hours in his command center, coordinating with his network, calling in favors, repositioning assets, and preparing for a conflict that would reshape Seoul's underworld regardless of who survived it. He had sent Courtney to one of the interior guest rooms, the safest location in the compound, reinforced and windowless, with instructions to rest while he handled the tactical response. She had nodded, said she understood, promised she would stay put. And now, she was trying to disappear into the pre-dawn darkness, with everything she owned compressed into a single bag. Jinho stood at the end of the hallway, still wearing his torn and dust-covered suit from the dinner, and felt something crack open in his chest that he had been trying to keep sealed. Where are you going? His voice was quiet, but it carried. Courtney froze, her hand on the service entrance door. She didn't turn around immediately, and Jinho could see her shoulders rise and fall with a breath that looked like it hurt. Away, she said finally. Somewhere they can't use me against you. There is nowhere they can't reach you if they want to. Jinho walked toward her slowly, each step measured. My enemies have networks in every city, every country. If you run, you'll just be alone when they find you. But if I stay, I'm a target you have to protect. Courtney turned around, and her face was composed, but her eyes betrayed everything, fear and love, and the exhausted pragmatism of someone who had spent her whole life making herself small to survive. Jinho, I came back to take care of you, not to destroy everything you built. This war, it's because of me, because I wore this ring, because I didn't have the sense to stay invisible. This war is because of me, Jinho said, stopping 3 feet away from her. Because I forgot who I was. Because I built an empire on fear instead of finding the people who made me human. Because I let you clean my house for 3 weeks while I watched you on monitors instead of having the courage to say, I remember. I never stopped remembering. I just didn't know how to be both the boy who made you that ring and the man who keeps himself safe. You can't be both, Courtney said, and her voice broke on the words. That's what I realized tonight. The boy who made this ring would never have become the Ice King. And the Ice King can't survive if he lets himself love someone the way that boy loved me. So I'm choosing for you. I'm leaving so you can go back to being the man who doesn't have weaknesses they can exploit. No, the word came out harder than Jinho intended. He closed the distance between them, taking her shoulders in his hands, not restraining, just grounding. You don't get to choose my survival over your presence. You don't get to decide that I'm better off alone. I spent 20 years alone, Courtney. 20 years building walls and eliminating threats and convincing myself that safety meant never needing anyone. And I was dying. Slowly. In a fortress full of everything, except the one thing that mattered. Jinho, when I saw your ring on that surveillance footage, when I realized you were the girl from the orphanage, I felt something I hadn't felt in 2 decades. Hope. His grip on her shoulders tightened slightly. Not hope that I could acquire more power or eliminate more enemies. Hope that maybe the boy I used to be wasn't completely dead. That maybe there was still a version of me that could eat stolen candy and make promises and believe that copper wire was enough if it came from the right hands. Courtney's eyes were wet now, tears tracking down her face in the dim hallway light. But that boy can't survive in your world. You know that. You became the Ice King because the world you operate in kills boys like him. Then maybe I need to operate in a different world. Jinho released her shoulders and reached into his pocket, pulling out something he had retrieved from his office before coming to find her. It was the photograph, the one from the orphanage, yellowed and creased, showing 2 children playing cards in a storage room. I kept this for 20 years. In every safe house, every apartment, every fortress. I told myself it was just a reminder of where I came from, but it wasn't. It was a reminder of who I wanted to be. And that boy wouldn't have let you leave. That boy would have fought to keep you even if it meant losing everything else. That boy didn't have everything else to lose. Courtney's voice was barely a whisper. That boy had you, and he thought that was everything. Jinho took her hand, the one with the copper ring, and held it between both of his. I spent 20 years acquiring power, and all it did was make me powerful. But you shared your rice with a starving stranger, and that made you rich in ways I'm only now beginning to understand. You're romanticizing poverty, Courtney said, but there was no heat in it. We were hungry, we were scared, we survived, but it wasn't beautiful. No, Jinho agreed. But we survived together, and somewhere between then and now, I forgot that survival isn't the same as living. I forgot that the point of becoming powerful was supposed to be creating a world where we didn't have to be afraid anymore. Instead, I just became better at being afraid, better at isolating, better at confusing control with safety. Courtney pulled her hand back, wrapping her arms around herself. So what are you saying? You're going to give up your empire, walk away from everything, pretend the past 20 years didn't happen. I'm saying I'm going to stop building my empire on forgetting. Jinho ran a hand through his hair, exhaustion finally catching up with him. I'm saying I'm going to find a way to be both the boy who made promises and the man who keeps them. I'm saying I don't know how to do that yet, but I want you to help me figure it out. Jinho, I'm a maid. I clean houses and stay invisible. I don't know how to help you run a criminal empire. I don't need help running an empire. Jinho stepped closer again, and this time his voice was soft, almost pleading. I need help being human. I need someone who remembers that I used to laugh. That I used to steal candy just for the thrill of it. That I used to make terrible jewelry and think it was romantic. I need someone who knew me before I became someone who fires 12 people over a moved photograph. You want me to fix you, Courtney said. I want you to remind me that I was never broken. Jinho reached out and gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. I was just scared, and I built an entire fortress to contain that fear. But you walked into my house and started organizing my books by meaning instead of color. You made kimchi and left it in my refrigerator without asking permission. You wore a copper ring to work even though it violated your contract. You did all of that because you remembered something I had forgotten. That being human isn't a weakness. It's the only thing worth protecting. Courtney closed her eyes, and Jinho could see the war happening behind her face, between the pragmatism that had kept her alive and the hope that had kept her wearing his ring for 20 years. If I stay, she said slowly, everything changes. You can't be the Ice King anymore. Not if you're the kind of man who kneels on the floor to retrieve a piece of wire. Good, Jinho said. I'm tired of being ice. I want to be the boy who believed you when you said he was worth saving. That boy is still in there, Courtney said, opening her eyes. I saw him every time you left me breadcrumbs, every time you chose to remember instead of forget. Then help me find him. Jinho took both her hands now, the duffel bag dropping to the floor between them. Help me be the person who deserves to wear that ring. Courtney looked at their joined hands, at the copper ring that had started this entire unraveling. Then she looked up at Jinho, and for the first time since she had entered his house 3 weeks ago, she smiled without trying to hide it. Okay, she said, but I have conditions. Anything. First, you make your own ring. If we're doing this, if we're actually keeping this promise, then you wear one too. Copper wire, just like mine. None of your platinum or gold or whatever expensive metal you can afford now. You wear the same garbage ring you gave me 20 years ago. Jinho felt his throat tighten. Deal, what else? Second, we eat real food, not the chef's fancy preparations, not the convenience store noodles you hide in the bottom of the refrigerator. We cook together. We eat together. We remember what it's like to share meals instead of just surviving them. Deal, what's the third condition? Courtney's smile widened slightly. Third, you stop watching me on those monitors. If you want to know what I'm doing, you ask me, like a normal person. No more surveillance. No more trying to understand me through cameras. Just talk to me. Jinho laughed, and it felt strange in his throat, rusty from disuse. That might be the hardest condition. I've been watching you for 3 weeks. It's become a habit. Break it, Courtney said. Break all your habits that keep you distant, starting now. Starting now, Jinho agreed. He picked up her duffel bag and handed it back to her. But you're not leaving, you're moving, out of the staff quarters and into, he paused, uncertain. Where do you want to be? Wherever you are, Courtney said simply. I didn't come back to clean your house. I came back to be with you. They stood in the hallway as dawn began to break outside, painting the fortress in shades of gold that felt less accusatory than they had a few hours ago. Jinho realized he was still holding her hand, still wearing his destroyed suit, still covered in dust from crawling on the floor to retrieve a ring that most people would consider worthless. I'm hungry, he said suddenly. Courtney blinked at the non sequitur. What? I'm hungry, and I don't want fancy food prepared by someone I've never met. I want, he trailed off, remembering. I want rice, simple rice, the kind we used to eat when it was all we had. Courtney's expression softened into something that looked like relief. I can make that. I can make that right now. They walked to the kitchen together, their hands still joined, and Jinho felt something shift in his fortress. The walls were still there, the security system still active, the threat still real, but none of it felt as heavy as it had before. In the kitchen, the billion-dollar kitchen with appliances Jinho had never used and counters that had never seen real cooking, Courtney pulled out a bag of rice from the pantry. The cheap kind, the kind Jinho kept hidden because it embarrassed him that he still craved poverty food when he could afford anything. She washed the rice in the sink, her movements automatic muscle memory from years of cooking for herself. Jinho watched her, and this time he wasn't watching through a monitor. He was there, present, sharing the space with her instead of observing from a safe distance. Can I help? He asked. Courtney glanced at him, surprised. You want to help cook rice? I want to do normal things, Jinho said. I want to remember what it's like to participate in my own life instead of managing it from behind screens. She handed him the pot. Fill this with water, 2 cups for every cup of rice. They cooked together in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than the one Jinho had been maintaining in his fortress. This silence was comfortable, shared, the kind that existed between people who didn't need to fill every moment with words because their presence was enough. The rice cooker bubbled. The sun continued to rise. And somewhere in Seoul, Jinho's enemies were planning their next move. But in this moment, in this kitchen, none of that mattered. When the rice was ready, Courtney scooped it into 2 bowls, not the expensive porcelain Jinho's designer had selected, but simple ceramic ones from the back of the cabinet. She added kimchi, the cheap store-bought kind from Jinho's secret shelf, and handed him a bowl. They sat at the kitchen island, on stools that had never been used, eating rice that tasted exactly like survival. "I need to make my ring," Jinho said between bites. "Now," Courtney asked. "Now, before anything else happens, before we get interrupted or attacked or pulled back into the war I just started." He set down his bowl. "Do you know where I can find copper wire at 4 in the morning?" Courtney smiled. "Actually, I do. I've been keeping supplies just in case." "In case of what?" "In case you remembered," she said quietly. "In case you wanted to keep the promise." She retrieved a small box from her bag, the one she had been planning to take with her when she left. Inside was copper wire, pliers, and a piece of sea glass she had collected from the same beach where they had found the original. Jinho's hands shook as he took the wire. His technique was rusty, his fingers less nimble than they had been at 13. But Courtney sat beside him, her hand on his shoulder, and guided him through the same clumsy twists and loops he had made 20 years ago. When he finished, the ring was as imperfect as the first one. Maybe more so, since his adult hands were less patient than his teenage ones had been. But when he slipped it onto his own 4th finger, left hand, it felt like coming home. They sat in the kitchen as the sun fully rose, both wearing copper rings, eating simple rice in a billion-dollar fortress, and Jinho realized that this moment of shared survival, of choosing each other over safety, was the empire he should have been building all along. "I love you," he said, and the words felt foreign in his mouth because he couldn't remember the last time he had said them to anyone. "I know," Courtney replied, holding up her hand so the morning light caught her ring. "You told me 20 years ago, with wire and sea glass and a promise you didn't know how to keep. And now you're learning." She reached across and took his hand, their matching rings touching. "Now we're both learning how to keep promises, how to be human, how to build something that matters more than power." Outside, Jinho's security detail was regrouping. Inside, the fortress still stood. And in the kitchen, 2 people who had survived being orphans and refugees and survivors were choosing each other again, the same way they had chosen each other in a cold warehouse 20 years ago. The war was coming. The consequences were mounting. The empire was fracturing. But Jinho, who used to be called the Ice King, was finally warm. And that was worth every bullet, every threat, every empire he had to burn down to remember how to be the boy who believed that love was more powerful than fear. They finished their rice in silence. Then Courtney cleared the bowls, and Jinho helped her wash them, and together they faced the dawn of a world they would have to rebuild. But this time, they would build it together. With copper rings and simple rice, and the kind of promise that couldn't be bought with money or protected by walls. The kind of promise that survived 20 years of separation and 3 weeks of hiding and 1 night of violence, because it was built on the only foundation that mattered. 2 people who had once been children, sharing their only meal, believing that someday they would be safe enough to stop surviving and start living. That someday had finally arrived.